All right, it's 7 o'clock. We're going to get started. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jason Ballou. I'm the Vice President and Membership Chair of the Kalamazoo chapter of Wild Ones. On behalf of the entire volunteer-based executive committee and team, we'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you all, especially on a cool, rainy spring night. Spring, it's here. We've turned the corner. First and foremost, I'd like to welcome our new members. If you can indulge me and stand up if you've joined the chapter this year in 2023. Anyone here? Brand new members? If you can stand, let's give them a big round of applause, a warm welcome. As some of you know, our membership drive is underway. So now through actually January 1st of this year through April 26th, all new members, either by becoming a new member or rejoining Kalamazoo Area Wild Ones, will receive a free copy of Nancy and Tom Small's book, which I don't seem to have. It's right here. There it is. Tom and Nancy are co-founders. There's Tom right over there, co-founder of the Kalamazoo Area chapter back in 1999. Right, Tom? Right. All right. So the book is called Using Native Plants to Restore Community. So the membership drive is retroactive to January 1st. So those of you who have joined to date will receive a copy of this book. Books can be picked up in person at our next month's programming meeting right here at the Portage Library on Wednesday, April 26th. One of our many membership perks is a free site visit and consultation to your home to recommend plants for your yard and your yard's unique conditions. We're starting these up again next month in April. So if you're interested, you can visit our website or you can see one of us after the meeting to sign up. Dave Wendling is the site visit guru. Lastly, remember to mark your calendars for our 9th annual Community Native Plant Sale coming up on Saturday, May 20th from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. at People's Food Co-op. Plants will be sold on a first-come, first-served basis, so we recommend you get there early. So now I'd like to turn it over to Paul Alexia, who will be introducing our speakers. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay with this? Good. Pleasure for me to be here and welcome all of you. It's good to see so many members here tonight. At a meeting of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity in December 2011, representatives from 188 governments adopted what is known as the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which promised to conserve and manage at least 30% of the planet for biodiversity and to restore 30% of the currently degraded ecosystems. Included within the degraded ecosystems not only would be desertification and deforestation, but I suggest also lawns, golf courses, highway right-of-ways, and so forth. Since then, what governments have done has varied quite a bit, even within our own government from year to year or from a presidential regime to another. But many individuals and organizations have become involved in work to conserve and restore natural habitats. In particular, Doug Tallamy's call for a homegrown national park, which he describes in his book, Nature's Best Hope, speaks directly to the issue of habitat restoration. The call has been heard by many of us, and more specifically has been responded to by Noel Ocen, a member of our executive committee for a number of years. A particular note among Noel's contributions has been her leadership in the Outreach and Education Committee, where she has assembled a valuable list of plants and resources. In addition to part of her role in that committee, she attends a number of public events each year to promote our chapter, and more recently has taken on the challenge of advocating implementation of Tallamy's Homegrown National Park. And it is on this topic that she and her co-speakers will present this evening. I was pleased to read recently that the National Wildlife Federation reports that the number of people planning to transform their lawns at least partially into wildlife habitat has increased from 9% in 2019 to 19% in 2021. That's more than double. So we're making progress, and we're looking forward to hearing what some of our speakers have been able to get done this evening. Noel?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that's just a touch high for me. That's a little better. Well, welcome. I was also going to say welcome on this beautiful spring day. Beautiful, not quite. Spring, yes, and we do need the rain, so I can go with that. Before we get started, I really do want to give a special thank you to the Portage District Library for inviting us and providing this facility for us, because we're going to be doing all of our in-house programs here from now on. And special thanks go to Quinn Edwards, who is not only is she a Wild Ones board member, but she also happens to be the assistant to the director of the library. And so she has really facilitated this move. And we do, of course, thank the director and the board for giving approval for it. So we really appreciate it. The facility is gorgeous. It's wonderful. Today's program is entitled, Are You on the Map? That is the Homegrown National Park map that was designed by Dr. Doug Tallamy, as Paul mentioned. Dr. Tallamy is an acclaimed environmental educator, researcher, writer, and lecturer who is focused on restoring native plants to regenerate biodiversity and support our critically endangered pollinators. Dr. Tallamy's Homegrown National Park initiative provides every one of us with a practical, doable approach to contributing to the solution of our climate crisis rather than continuing to be a part of the problem. Part one of today's program is a video of one of Dr. Tallamy's lectures explaining the challenges facing the environment, the need for immediate action, and his proposal to involve all of us in the solution. The second part of the program features several of our Wild Ones members who are already in various stages of restoring native plants to their properties, some just initially getting started and others obviously extremely mature. So in the interest of keeping to our timetable, when we are finished with the presentation, don't ask questions during each one. We'll ask all the questions at the end because we want to make sure that we can meet our timetable here tonight. And let's see. Now, I will get this video started.
We're going to talk about what the rep is. But first, I'm going to start with a story. This is a being I saw in my yard last summer. Looks like a fecal sac that a bird dropped out of its nest. If you take a closer look, you say, well, gee, maybe that's a spider. Look at it at night. Indeed, it is a spider. It's a bola spider. And this is how bola spiders hunt. They drop a single strand of silk. Somebody's got a mute out there, I think. And they put a little sticky glob of glue at the end. And it looks like they're going to go fishing with it. Well, I didn't think this spider would be able to catch anything, but a few minutes later it did. A moth flew in and it got caught on its sticky glob of glue, wraps it up in silk, has a nice meal. And if it does that enough time, it has the energy to create an egg mass. And that's exactly what this spider did. As a matter of fact, she made 3 egg masses. So how does she catch a moth like this? Well, she's actually releasing the sex pheromone of particular species of moth. I wanted to know what the species was, so I unwrapped the things that she was catching, and it turned out it's the bronze cutworm. She caught 10 bronze cutworms in a row in my yard, and I've got bronze cutworms and the caterpillars that create a bronze cutworm because I've got goldenrod. That's their favorite host plant. And the tree I was looking at was an oak tree, which produced this beautiful moth, a dot line white, and I've got dot line whites produced by this tree in my yard because I didn't rake the leaves away, because there's a dot line white cocoon in this little leaf mass right here. And there it is. I'm sure you saw it right away. Here it is up close. If you rake them away, you've just thrown away that beautiful moth. I've got evening primrose moths in my yard because I've got evening primrose. So the moth comes and spends the day with its head stuffed in the flower. It's very cute. I've got zebra swallowtails because I've got pawpaws that I planted there for that exact reason, to attract that beautiful moth. It would take me a week or more to describe all of the species that are now calling our property home because of the plants that we have put back there. It would not take me a week. It wouldn't take me very long at all to describe all the species that are living in a landscape like this, a typical suburban landscape. There is no goldenrod, so there are no bronze cutworms, so there are no bola spiders. There are no oaks, so there are no dot line whites or hundreds of other species. There are no pawpaws, so there's, oh, give me a break. I don't know why I do that. There we go. So there are no zebra swallowtails. Sorry about that. There are no enotheras, no evening primroses. So we have no evening primrose moths. There is very little life that can live in a typical landscape like this. And of course, you know that. But that is why we're seeing some pretty scary headlines. The insect apocalypse is here, talking about global insect decline. North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. A third of our North American bird population is already gone. 2/3 of Earth's wildlife is gone. 1 million species face extinction in the next 20 years. 40% of Earth's plants face extinction. These are big problems, folks. These are big problems. And they're problems because we have not shared the planet with the natural world. We're taking the resources for ourselves. And that's why Elizabeth Kolbert gets to write the 6th Great Extinction. I'll bet she would have been happier if she didn't have to write that book. Jason Hinkle says biodiversity loss is such a strange euphemism for the mass destruction of non-human beings. It's the genocide of nature is really what we're talking about. So what's our reaction to these sobering statistics? People are actually studying that. Richard Hobbs wrote a paper about it. He likens our reactions to the 5 stages of grief that we experience when we get typically a news of a terminal illness. First, there's denial. We certainly have plenty of people denying that we have a problem at all. Then there's anger. I feel a little bit of that sometimes. Bargaining, depression, I feel a little bit of that sometimes too. And then the final stage of grief is acceptance. And this is where I take issue. Acceptance is too easily equated with giving up. And giving up's not an option, folks, because nature is not optional. We absolutely need it. So we need a 6th step here, and that is action. That's what Homegrown National Park's all about, taking action. And we do have existing national parks, and they were created primarily because they had exquisite scenery. They were beautiful places. Teddy Roosevelt said, we've got to preserve these places because that's good administration. Natural beauty is a national asset, and recreation produces good citizenship. So our parks were created largely because they were pretty places in which we could play. And that's why we only have about 12% of the US that's formally protected. These dark green areas are where we have our major parks because there's not all that many places that are exquisitely beautiful where we can play. What's happening outside the parks, though, has been appalling. Every 30 seconds, a football field worth of America's natural resources disappears to development. Development, I think it's the most oxymoronic word we have, certainly in the field of ecology. We've got over 40 million acres of lawn. That's an area the size of New England dedicated to an ecological deadscape. And an even deader scape is what we've paved over. We've paved over an area larger than Ohio. There are 2 million acres of golf courses. That's an area larger than Rhode Island and Delaware combined. And we could go on talking about many other statistics. Now, Matt Lee Ashley has observed that evaluating the condition of nature is a bit like watching a leaking pipe. If a person focuses on each drop as it falls to the floor, the leak doesn't seem very damaging. But if you leave for a day, you come back, your room is going to be full of water. And that's exactly what has happened. Now, we talk about an extinction crisis. It is indeed an extinction crisis, but I don't think extinction is the right metric that we should use. We have an extinction crisis, But we have to think about the degradation of common species. Species like the picture you're seeing here, this is the American chestnut. Used to be the dominant tree in our eastern deciduous forests from Maine all the way to Georgia. It's not extinct yet, but it's functionally extinct. It is wiped out by the chestnut blight. The rusty patch bumblebee used to be one of the most common bees in North America. Now it's a big deal if anybody sees even one of them. So it's functionally extinct. Beavers. Now beavers are making somewhat of a comeback, but they used to be common in every stream system of the entire country. Their elimination drastically changed the hydrology of the entire country, and it wasn't for the better. So we're really talking about defaunation. That's the real problem. It's local and it's everywhere. Enter E.O. Wilson, Harvard emeritus. Everybody knows Edward O. Wilson spent his life studying lots of things, but he certainly was trying to save biodiversity. And probably his biggest contribution in that regard was this book that he wrote in 2016, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. And in this book, he noted that in order to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we're going to have to save nature. We're going to have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet. And if we don't do that, it's going to just disappear everywhere. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't tell us a whole lot about how we were going to do that. Now, fortunately, and somewhat to my surprise, people are actually listening to his Half Earth initiative. The UN has created a global initiative. First, the 30 by 30, we're going to save 30% of the planet by 2030. And that's step one going towards 50 by 50. So the UN is doing what the UN does. They get a bunch of people together and they're negotiating how we're going to protect biodiversity. And it's not going any better than all the negotiations about climate change have gone. Can you imagine negotiating whether or not we're going to save life on planet Earth? Well, that's exactly what the UN is doing. And everybody's got this notion in their head that we're actually going to save 50% of the Earth as pristine ecosystems. How could this be possible? Well, it can't be possible. It's not possible. Half of planet Earth is already in some form of agriculture, certainly not pristine. We've got 7.9, soon to be 8 billion people in the other half, along with all of our infrastructure and our detritus. There isn't 50% of planet Earth that is still pristine. So how can we realize EO's dream? Well, actually, I think the answer is obvious. We're going to need a new approach to conservation, and it's not about putting pristine areas aside. It's about restoring the areas that we have destroyed, and we're going to do that by finding ways for humans and nature to coexist. In the past, we've had this idea that they cannot coexist. But what I have been arguing for a long time now is that coexisting with nature is now the only viable option that's left to us. We absolutely have to find ways to do that. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. So we now need to practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. And I'm not just talking about conserving what's there. I'm talking about restoring what is already lost. So in other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, but thrive. So if protected areas are not large enough, we're going to have to practice conservation outside of those protected areas, outside of preserved areas. So we're going to have to practice conservation in areas like this, but also in areas like this. And as Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young once said, if you can't be with the nature you love the nature you're with. I might break into song if I think about that too much. Where are we talking about? We're talking about private property. 78% of the US is privately owned. And 85% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. So we have to practice conservation on private property. And lawn is the low-hanging fruit. It's really what got me thinking about Homegrown National Park to begin with. We have more than 40 million acres of lawn. That's a 2005 statistics, so we know it's bigger than that now. And you know, it is a leftover from the class system, the aristocracy of Europe. We're the only ones who could afford lawn, and so it's a status symbol, and we love our status symbols. Dedicated to an ecological deadscape. So I know we need lawn for high status, and we need lawn to display our Halloween decorations. But what if we replanted half the area that is now in lawn? That's the idea I had way back in 1987. That would give us 20 million acres that we could put towards conservation right at home. We could create Homegrown National Park, which will be huge. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountain. Add up all those parks, it's still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park will be the biggest park in the country. I started talking about that in my talks for years. And then I finally, when I wrote Nature's Best Hope, I included it as a chapter. But, talk is cheap. That's pretty much all I do. And then I did meet Michelle, and she talked about how this started. She came up to me after a talk and said, you're just talking to the choir. And I said, yes, it's only the choir who invites me. And she said, well, you're not going to succeed unless you get beyond the choir. You have to use social media, you've got to use marketing, and you've got to do all the things that I know. She was correct. I said, I don't do those things. And she said, I do those things. So let's do it. And that's where homegrownnationalpark.org came from. The ideas you see expressed here are all Michelle's. What are we asking in Homegrown National Park? We're saying we need to reduce the area in lawn. That is the low-hanging fruit. We've got to put more natives into our landscapes, and we've got to remove the invasive species that are already there. Our product is national awareness, not just of what the problem is, but what the solutions are. We're going to change the culture. We're going to recognize that nature's not optional. It's not something we should do. It's something we absolutely must do. And it's everybody's responsibility to do it. And the map, once it's fully operational, will allow us to measure our conservation progress. It'll be a powerful scientific tool. Homegrown National Park is going to convert hope to action. We need action. It's aspirational. It doesn't rely on governmental support. Not that we would turn it down if anybody offers it. It's going to merge existing conservation efforts like Audubon and National Wildlife Federation and Wild Ones. We're not, it's no paid membership here. We're not stealing members from anybody. We're uniting them so that we can all have one visual in terms of our progress. And that visual will reveal holes in our biological corridors that we're going to need in order to connect the wild places that remain. So what we're envisioning is something like the COVID maps you see in the New York Times, where each county will be colored in with the progress it's making. This is a simulation, of course, but we're talking about a science-based grassroots call to action that can address the two major problems we have in this on planet Earth. We've got climate change, but we've got a biodiversity crisis, and Homegrown National Park will address both of those simultaneously. So what's the rush? Well, remember these statistics. They're not waiting. They're coming every day. There is great urgency in enacting this Homegrown National Park solution. We've got 48 million residential landscapes in the US. If we add 1,000 properties to Homegrown National Park each month, it sounds like great progress, but it'll take us 4,083 years to reach all of them. So that's not quite fast enough. If we look at that in terms of property size, the average lot size in the US is 0.3 of an acre. So if we add 1,000 acres to Homegrown National Park each month, it'll take us 1,200 years to convert all landscapes. Ooh, somebody's got to mute. So who's going to help Homegrown National Park make this rapid transition? The problem is most people do not garden themselves. They just hire somebody. It's not that they don't like nature or they don't like gardening. They don't have time. They're raising kids or doing other things. So they hire somebody. So what we need to do is create the person that they're going to hire. We need to create a team of skilled ecological landscapers. There are groups doing that now. We need more of them. They need to do it faster. Every place I go to give a talk, people say, who can I hire? And I usually don't know. But once this team is in place, these people are going to have the information that everybody needs. Ecological landscapers are going to know that every landscape has 4 ecological responsibilities. It's got to support food webs so that we have functioning ecosystems. It's got to sequester carbon, get that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. It has to manage our watershed, and it has to support pollinators. And they're going to know that lawn accomplishes none of those goals. So our fascination with the lawn is going to end. They're going to know that plant choice matters. There are 3 kinds of plants out there: contributors, non-contributors, and detractors. A contributing plant is one that's helping to enhance local ecosystems. It's going to be a native. Some are much better than others. A non-contributor would be something like ginkgo biloba from Asia. It's not an invasive plant, but it contributes very little to ecosystem function. And a detractor would be an invasive plant like calorie pear, which becomes an ecological tumor. It escapes and pushes out the native plants in our functioning ecosystems. Ecological landscapers are going to know that caterpillars are an essential component to our landscapes. They are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. And they're going to know that keystone plants are keystone plants because they support the most caterpillars. Just 14% of our native plants are supporting 90% of the caterpillar food that drives our food webs, which makes keystone plants essential components of the ecological houses that we're building. They're the support system. Our house isn't going to stand up without keystone plants. We've been trying to build ecological houses out of wallpaper for the last 100 years, and that doesn't work. They're also going to know that insects are the little things that run the world. E.O. Wilson's famous statement. They're going to know that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat the particular plants for which they have the adaptations to get around their particular defenses. So think monarch butterflies eating toxic milkweeds. Very few other insects can do that. You take away the milkweeds, you take away the monarch butterflies. They're going to know that we need pollinators, but they're also going to know it's not because they're pollinating a third of our crops. You hear that every day on the news. It's actually about a 1/12 of our crops. But then people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Everybody needs pollinators because they're pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. Losing our pollinators is not an option unless we want to lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. They're also going to know that light pollution and mosquito fogging are two of the major causes of insect declines, and they're fairly easily reversed. If we put in yellow bulbs instead of our white bulbs, it's going to decrease insect loss to light pollution, and we can, of course, fire Mosquito Joe pretty easily. They're going to know that tiny properties can be very important in terms of conservation. It can happen on any size property, right from a flower pot on up. And most of all, they're going to know that conservation works. It's going to make it worthwhile. And I'll give you just one example of what's happened at our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. This is what it looked like when we moved in. It was part of a farm that was broken up into 10-acre lots. And had been mowed for hay. Very little life there. As a matter of fact, where it wasn't mowed for hay, it was nothing but invasive plants. That's my wife Cindy there getting rid of these invasives. It can be done. This is what it looks like today. And once our research showed that the number of moth species you have in your local food web is a great index for how healthy that food web is, how complex and stable it is. I started counting the moth species that have come to our barren landscape since we moved in, and I am up to 1,140 species of moths, that's 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state of Pennsylvania. They are there because we put the plants back. And because so many of them are types of bird food, we now support 60 species of birds that have bred on our property, not flew by, but bred. But is reducing the lawn enough? That was the low-hanging fruit, but if you look at the numbers, there are issues with that. We've got 1.9 billion acres in the lower 48 states. Less than 12% or 228 million acres are protected, so not very much. That leaves 1.6 billion acres unprotected. Now, 78% of that, or 1.3 billion acres, is privately owned. If Homegrown National Park restores 20 million of those acres, that's only 1.53% of what really needs to be restored. So our goals are too modest. We have to increase them by doing more than shrinking the lawn. Most of our privately owned land is in small woodlots, cropland, and rangeland, and we want to get owners of all those properties in Homegrown National Park as well. There are 406 million acres of woodlots managed by private citizens, not logging companies, in the U.S. If they're managed properly, by managing the invasives in those woodlots and by sustainably harvesting those woodlots, they all should be on Homegrown National Park. This is where our croplands are. 410 million acres are now in cropland. Big area. But there are things that our farmers can do. We can restore the native plants on the edges of the fields. We can put in prairie strips. We can restore hedgerows that have been removed, and we can stop using neonicotinoid pesticides. All of those things will vastly increase the biodiversity in our farmlands. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland, all of which could be good habitat if it's managed properly. We overgraze an awful lot of it. That, by the way, is 4.5 times the size of Texas. If we restore the riparian corridors that go through those rangelands, research is showing that that restores the biodiversity over the entire area. Very doable. Now, there's something that's common to each one of these conservation approaches. I learned this from one of my students in a class last semester. In a paper she wrote, she said, we claim to be managing species and habitats, but what we're really managing is people. And that's what we're talking about with Homegrown National Park. We're managing the people that own all of this land. It has been degraded because of the way we've treated our land, but we can also restore it. So we're talking about changing the culture. We've mentioned that, but it's so important. Right now, it's an adversarial relationship with nature. We must change it to a collaborative one if this is going to work. So what's the rush? We're rapidly destroying the natural world that supports us. Our parks and preserves are not enough. So we got to practice conservation outside of parks and preserves on private property. Global conservation initiatives, they sound good on paper and the UN's talking about it, but we can't wait for them to actually come up with actionable recommendations. We've been waiting for climate change and it's just not happening. So the power and responsibility of Earth stewardship really resides in the individual, each one of us. That's a new message to most of the people on the planet. Our challenge is to make this a reality, to make it part of our culture. Can we do it? I think we can. We don't have to save biodiversity for a living, but we can save it where we live. And if we're doing that, we certainly need to join Homegrown National Park. It empowers each one of us. You know, the Earth's problems are huge and most people feel absolutely powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can do all the things we just talked about. They can shrink the lawn, they can put in a pollinator garden, they can get rid of their invasive plants, they can turn out their lights, they can fire Mosquito Joe, they can shrink the lawn, do all the things I forgot to tell you. One person can do that and totally revitalize their local ecosystem. And it shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the planet that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, you help somebody who does. So Aldo Leopold said a number of wonderful things. And one of them was, there are some who can live without wild things and some who cannot. Now, I know he was talking about the emotional connection with nature, but actually no one can live very long without wild things, for it's the wild things that keep us alive.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Tallamy is fascinating. I'm sure that you all enjoyed that as much as I did. But now what I have are 5 people who are already active restorers on their properties, and they're going to spend a few minutes showing you what they have done and telling you what their plans are. The first one is Quinn, whom we talked about earlier, who is the assistant to the director here, and she's kind of wearing 2 hats tonight because she's doing a restoration here on the library property as well as her own yard. So Quinn, I will let you get started on
Thank
this.
you so much. Well, this presentation and bringing wild ones to the library is kind of full circle for me tonight. So I'm really pleased to have everyone here at the library, and we look forward to hosting wild ones into the future. So I'm here to talk about 2 gardens that are already on the Homegrown National Park map, and the first one is right here at Portage District Library. So I'm going to give you a little backstory, how we got started. So this is in 2018. We had just had a presentation here at the library from another Wild Ones member, Ilse Gebhard. If you've never heard her talk about monarchs, it is fantastic. She is such a knowledgeable person. And we had some library people including some longtime library volunteers who were also master gardeners, who took a look at this spot on the north side of our building and said, we could do something over there. We had just taken down some pine trees, we had a lot of dirt, and we talked with ILSA and got some recommendations to start our own monarch way station. So this is a picture in 2018 after we planted plugs, which were milkweed and then plants that would support monarchs throughout the full growing season. So spring blooming plants, summer, and fall. And so this is what it looked like on the north side of our building, which is over this way, in 2018. And then I have some pictures from 2019 and 2020 as those plants started to grow. Now, we did initially replace the mulch every year. That is something that I don't know that we'll continue to do going forward because those plants really are filling in well. But you can see how it's growing and expanding. You can also see more open areas where we trialed some things that didn't work, and that's okay too, because a lot of the process is learning and trial and error and experimenting. So then the picture on the, let's see, left-hand side here is 2021. As some of you, maybe most of you know, the library did an extensive renovation of our building in 2021. So we moved out to a temporary location and we said, please do not touch our monarch way station. So you can see the equipment in the back digging out for our additional space, but they did not touch the monarch way station, and it sat happily without too much care for that year that we were not here in this building. And then finally we get to 2022. There's a little on the right-hand side and some more here. The renovation tore up a lot of the remaining grass on our property, and we said, do we want to replace grass and hire someone to come and mow for us again and spend money putting back in an irrigation system? And at the library, we decided that we did not want to do that. So we do not have a regular lawn service. We do not have irrigation on the property. We are growing native plants. So these are pictures from where we expanded the grass around the original Monarch Way Station, and then also the front of the building where we took out burning bush. And we had Kalamazoo Nature Center Ecological Services come and help us install all of these plugs. So this was last summer, and they are out there sleeping right now. I can't wait for it to get warmer to see how everyone has done. In the summer times, I usually do a Monarch Way Station tour once a month. I might do it twice a month. So if you're interested in seeing the garden, take a look at the library's website and you can come and do a tour and we can talk about the specific plants that are out there. We also have a seed library here at the library, which started, there is a statewide group that do seed libraries and help kind of provide some guidance. But our seed library also includes seeds for native plants because we have all these wonderful seed-producing plants on our property. So we're collecting milkweed, ironweed, golden Alexander, lots of different plants, and putting those seeds in our seed library to share. So I know we gave out a ton of brochures, but there is also a seed library brochure on the counter and some seeds that are native that don't require cold stratification that you could even plant this year. And if they're all gone, we can go upstairs to the seed library and dig some more out. So those are free. You do not have to be a member of the library. They are available to the community. And then the other garden, very, very quickly, this is my house. So from the first time I saw a monarch at the library's Monarch Way Station, I said, forget the grass, we're doing this at my house too. My husband is very patient. He's not much into gardening, but he lets me do what I want. So we went wild with it. So We had some trees that came down in a storm. We had a ton of vinca and Rose of Sharon, and we put in a cement patio, and I got to work. So this is what it looks like after a few years of growing. It's quite full. It's beautiful. I love it. I love sitting on the patio and watching birds come by. I've seen countless types of butterflies, moths, different species of bees. And this is, a 1.5 miles down the road. So hopefully between the library and my house, we're helping to create a corridor for pollinators and birds and the monarchs, and providing some of that habitat that is so desperately needed. So there's my little garden.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mel Luna, who is also a Wild Ones member, and she happens to be the editor of our monthly newsletter, Seedlings. So, please.
Okay, let's see. This is great to see you all. I'm going to jump right in with a quick overview. I bought my first house. I made a plan to get rid of the lawn, and while doing that, I discovered Wild Ones. So, let's see. Yes. Nope, the other way. Okay. So here is the house on the bottom left corner that we bought in the fall of 2020, and then up above that, that's what it looks like last summer. And I knew I wanted to get rid of the grass, but at the time I was more permaculture minded than native ecosystem focused, which led me to believe that I needed to build the soil by adding as much organic matter as possible to introduce life back into what I saw as a deadscape of lawn. So that fall, I gathered up a few dozen landscaping bags of leaves from family and neighbors and let them begin to decompose in piles, and then I spent the winter dreaming. Everything that wasn't a path would be a planting bed. I sketched out a rudimentary design on paper, and in the spring, I used old hoses and rope to see and modify the curving pathways. When the spring came in 2021, my first mistake was to spend over $300 on 10 yards of compost from a landscape supply company. It was filled with plastics, which you can see, and oh goodness, and it was lifeless as well as being water repellent. So last year, I ended up breaking that pile out and planting directly into it with natives like lupin and Monarda punctata, who like dry, sandy soils, and I'll find out this year how they do. In contrast, my neighbor was having tree work done, so I scored a mountain of free mulch for my pathways by having the tree guys empty their truck in my front yard. My plan was to dig up the sod in the paths and then flip it over onto the planting bed to kill the grass without losing any organic matter, which you can see in that bottom left corner. Well, yeah, all three of those are to kind of illustrate the process. So then after I'd flipped it over onto the grass, then I would put leaf mulch on top to protect any life that might be in the soil. Then I'd level the dirt path, lay down a thick layer of cardboard, and then fill it in with tree mulch, which I had in abundance. This way, if I changed my mind about the paths later, then I'd still be building the soil as the mulch broke down. I did this in the front and the backyards simultaneously. So what that ended up doing was creating channels for rainwater, which was a good way to capture the water since the wood mulch acts like a sponge. But the results, it results in the planting beds being pretty dry because the beds are up higher than the paths. You live and learn. So what you see up in the upper right corner is that it's a little bit of a fast forward, because getting involved with Wild Ones that summer introduced me to a community of ecologists and mentors that informed the direction of my plantings. I'd already put in some shrubs from one of the Conservation District sales, aronia, elderberry, buttonbush, and I did manage to get some plants in that year as I began to have beds to put them into. But most importantly, with the help of Kim Patry and the inspiration from Dave Wendling, I installed a rain garden at the end of that first year. And so that's what that looked like in the upper corner. And down in the lower right-hand corner is what it looked like the very next summer. And just as I was using the last of the mulch, I heard a truck processing trees down the road and decided to get another load. So the upper left corner here, you can see the second winter passed. You can see the mountain of mulch over on the right, and then the stupid compost over on the left. But at least this time I had some natives to look forward to returning in spring. Quinn also inspired me to try my hand at winter sowing for an inexpensive way to acquire a lot more plants, which is in that lower left corner. And then up in the upper right, those are some of the natives that returned that following spring. And then last year was a flurry of activity of a different kind. Now that I had a place to put them, I welcomed all the native plants. I visited gardeners and took home their overflow. I visited all the native nurseries and came home with treasures. Plant swaps, plant sales, plant rescue missions, I was there. I cannot count how many times I filled my Subaru to bursting, emptied it, then filled it again, which is the upper right corner. Many went into my yard, which always seemed to have room, but others went to neighbors and family members and back out to the community at the swaps. And after working so hard to get rid of the grass, I finally saw the light and started incorporating native grasses into the beds. I'm sticking with prairie dropseed and little blue stem for now. And I've got some purple love grass from that first plant sale that I'm keeping an eye on. So up in the upper left and then the lower left is the backyard in 2020, and then here it is last fall. So I focus on showing you some of my process today, but the reason behind it all is the joy that I get when I see that I've created a sanctuary for the fascinating little beings that we share this planet with. In my tiny yard, I've observed many species of bees, butterflies, caterpillars, chipmunks, flies, hummingbirds, moths, praying mantis, squirrels, toads, woodchucks, wasps, and dozens of bird species, including hawks. Let's see. So this American lady caterpillar is on its host plant, prairie pussy toes, and it morphed into the butterfly below it. With Quinn's protection and care. I took it over her house as soon as I found it. And in the lower right corner, you can see that thanks to the wood leaf and the leaf mulch, the wood mulch and the leaf mulch, I have an abundance of fungi in my yard, including these volunteer morels. So if that's not enough of a plug, you too could have morels. My yard is now a thriving, growing, dynamic ecosystem that is ever-changing, and it is my great pleasure to observe and respond to it. Thank you.
Our next speaker you may remember from last month's program, because Mike Weiss put on an absolutely delightful Designing Native Plant Gardens last month. And so this week, we're happy to have him back to show us now what he's doing in his current yard.
How do I forward?
Right there.
That. Okay, thank you.
There you go.
All right, I'm winging this one, so I can't remember. Is this a... These aren't mine. All right.
There you go.
Yeah. Yep.
You should be able to.
Okay, so I moved here from Chicago in the summer of 2020 in this house here, and this is what we moved into. I was unemployed when we moved in, so I got started right away in reversing what kind of someone started before for probably 50 years before me. Behind the house, there's like a bit of oak savanna. I mean, it's being run over by Norway maple trees, but I could tell that's kind of like my first clue. Whenever I go to an area, I want to look at the mature trees, and that kind of gives you an idea of what the natural community must have been like before there was European settlement. So that's the first place I go to take a look to get an idea of how I want to convert a yard. And I noticed there was 3 really beautiful black oaks back there, and I live just up the street is Oakland. I live in the Winchell neighborhood, and there's some beautiful black oaks, white oaks, and even a couple of bur oaks. So, and then I start looking around at the soil, and I take my little auger and I drill into it, and I see what happens when I do that, and I see it's pretty sandy, and this yard, in fact, faces southwest, and it's on a hill, and I always joke that it's the hottest, driest yard in Kalamazoo, I have no idea why the previous owners did not plant a tree there, because that house is just cooking in the summertime. It's super hot. So that was my first thing that I wanted to do, was plant a tree. So I planted a bur oak and, let's see, tulip poplar, dwarf chinkapin oak, and a couple of, I can't remember, some dogwoods. Anyways, and then I got started on the front yard, which was all lawn, those Japanese yews, and this is the big project, is this English ivy. It's on a really steep slope. English ivy, vinca vine, and lawn. And I didn't really know how to deal with that because it's such a steep slope. And before I got into doing other people's yards and learning a lot from working restoration, the way I would kill the existing vegetation would be to smother it with cardboard and then put mulch on top of it. But there was no way I was going to be able to do that. And I asked advice for people, and everyone told me, there's no way you could do this. You're going to have to tier it. And I was like, man, I don't want to do that. That's like a lot of work. That's heavy equipment. That sounds like a nightmare. And then I had a revelation when I was wandering in an oak savanna, and I saw a slope that looked like mine, and I noticed all the beautiful plants that were growing on. I was like, man, I could do this. So I took what I learned from working with Swim Lake, and I decided I'm going to use herbicide for this. And what I did is I cut back all that English ivy. It was super thick, like really like about a foot thick, and I kept cutting until I got to the base at the ground, and at that point I cut and then dabbed it with triclopyr, because there's no way you're gonna pull that out. If you pull that out, that's been rooted in for decades. That slope would totally erode because the soil is very sandy and almost dusty. So I left that in there, and then I was working with Chad at Hidden Savannah. He's like, you better get stuff in there fast, and get stuff that really takes roots in really quickly and grows the first year. So that's what I did here. Let's see. The top right one, I started plugging the heck out of it with stuff like lance leaf coreopsis that grows super quick, western sunflower, Cytodes grama, Monarda punctata fills in and flowers within that first year. What else? Little blue stem. I plugged the heck out of it as much as I could quickly after I removed the ivy. And let's see, so that is upper right is probably, I thought I left the years on here. So that's probably the after the second year. Lower right is starting to fill in. Top left is from last, so that's last August. That would have been 2 years, and it's really filled in tightly. Let's see here. Oops. Okay, so this process here, it shows you the other side of it on the top left, which is, I didn't even notice that these rocks were in here, especially in the ivy part. They're completely obscured by the ivy. And once I got in there, there's barely any soil in there. So I couldn't drill. I couldn't dig with a shovel. So I was using my fingers and taking seedlings and poking them in there and just hoping that they were going to stay in there. And right on the corner, like in here, it was really tight with rocks. So I put pussy toes, bird's foot violet, which is probably going to get totally destroyed by the pussy toes because the pussy toes move in. Probably a better solution would have been GM prairie smoke. So that's what I did later on over here. So that filled in really quick. To see the lanceolate coreopsis in the bottom right really filled in that first year. Oh, on the top right, you see the pussy toes in bloom. So that it saved that hill from eroding, and it really worked out. Let's see. Top left is an early a shot shortly after I marked out the area that I was going to create the garden. And I edged it with metal edging. Let's see, the bottom left was with tuberosa, butterfly milkweed. I call that the solstice plant. That really always blooms at about the solstice time. And then these other two, top right and bottom right, are from last summer. So that's only 2 years after I started this process. I plant heavy, though. I don't really, I get pretty bold with it, and I plant with 1 foot centers. And that hill is probably, as any open soil I'm filling with plant, because I saw once I started irrigating, it just started dripping. The soil was dripping away, and it was freaking me out. Every storm, I went out there in the rain, and I wanted to see if I'm going to totally lose my hill. And I did lose some rocks, but the plants really filled in. They rooted in, and now I am very confident that this thing is really stable. And the bottom right is on the top of the hill. So it kind of levels out, and that's filled in nicely. Monarda punctata, you can't point there. It fills in quickly, and whenever it goes to seed, I take the seed and spread it all over, because if you have bare soil, it can really fill in those gaps. I think of it as a filler plant. It's temporary. Let's see, do I have any more? That's not me. Okay. Sorry. So I think that's about it.
Our next speaker is Ann Klobuchar, who is a longtime Wild Ones member, and her property is several acres. So we've been looking at urban settings before. Now we're going to look at a much more rural setting.
How do I go from place to place?
All right, you go. Let's see.
Page up and page down?
Whoops, there we go. I'm sorry, went backwards.
Is that
There
the
we
down?
go.
The down.
So
Okay.
it's the down one. And so you
Okay.
can start with that. And
Okay. A little background. I feel like an old pro here. Listening to these people are pretty young. I've been gardening for a long time. I got involved with Wild Ones in 2003. I built my property out in Texas Township. I have 4 acres. I built a house out there when I was 64 years old. So I built with the idea that it was going to be my retirement home, and it needed to be barrier-free. And I wanted native garden, so I didn't have to, I want a garden, I'm a gardener, but I didn't want to have to worry about it when I got old. So when I first started, the first thing I did, this is fairly, the first one, when I first built, all of the soil that was displaced, and I never put in the yard. I brought in some topsoil, because it was where I built in front of the house was where an older house had been, and it was just fill sand. So I did bring in some topsoil and some wood chips and planted what I had available, irises and all the usual perennials, which I had available for my old house. And then a lot of wood chips and things like that. This is the one, the first one is the first couple, in 2015. I started gardening there in 2012. So the first one, the first picture, this one up here is 2015, and the one to the right of that is in the early spring of that year. And then there's one from July. It must be the one with the irises for July. And then I don't think they're in the right order. But I had a few milkweed plants out by the road, and the road commission came through, the power company came through and cut a bunch of trees down. And one of the things I had was a bunch of, what's the one that comes up, forsythia. And there were a bunch of little seedlings in there, and the guy said, well, we're going to have to take some of your forsythia down. I says, cut it all. So what happened is I ended up with a great big area that was chips, because I'm like Mel, I go out when I hear the truck grinding anywhere in the neighborhood, and I tell them, would you like to bring your chips and dump them? So I've had a lot of free chips. It's a great way to get chips. I think I've had to buy chips that very beginning, and then with my newest bed, I ended up having to buy chips because I couldn't find anybody cutting down trees. If I'd only waited till this year. But anyways, where the forsythia was, there was a few milkweed, and I just let them kind of spread in. So they have done that. This is still, let's see. This is still the older plants. We're in 16 there. But I'm filling in, I'm putting in lots of natives here and there, and I'm trying to get rid of the irises. If they die, they die. I try to give away anything that isn't a native. I'm giving away. If anybody comes and wants to dig it up, they're welcome to it. I do have native lupin on my property. The property is mostly dry and sunny. It's an oak savanna kind of area, so it's dry and sunny. I've got oak, and there were lupin, which is one of the first things I fell in love with on the property, was the lupin growing out there in the woods. And I started out replacing, let's see, down there where you can see Millie, my dog, in the lower left. That was one of my first gardens. And unfortunately, I put way too many Indian grass, but there's a lot of other stuff in there too that's pretty good stuff. And I've planted quite a few trees. There's a blue beech down in there. There's a chestnut or an elm, I can't remember. There's a catalpa down in there. But all the trees I've planted, except for one ginkgo, have been native trees. The one to the bottom right, that is my part of my septic system that you're not supposed to plant anything on. But I did, because it was just a big area and you can't plant grass. So I planted stuff that I probably shouldn't have planted, because the one septic guy that came and pumped me out a couple years ago said I should get rid of some of that. Well, I haven't touched it, so so oh well. But I think I started replacing, the dates on this are totally screwy. I started replacing all my beds that I had chips in the walkways. I replaced that with no grass that I got from a nursery in Wisconsin, Prairie Nursery. And all the grass that I've planted has been called Nomo. It's not a native grass, but you don't water it, you don't fertilize it, you mow it about once a month. I think I mow it maybe 3 or 4 times a year. So that's all the grass I planted. This is still some of the old stuff. Looking south across the front part of my property, there's a bed where it doesn't look like there's much planted to the back. We're talking about the top left. That's one of my newer beds. My aim in planting beds is ease of mowing. If you don't like to mow it, rip it out and plant natives. That's kind of my motto. And so that's probably my 4th or 5th bed that is still filling in. And then beyond that, you can see grass. Well, I ended up planting, let's see, what have we got here? The only tree I left that I didn't replace was my crabapple. That's a crabapple tree there. But I get a lot of cedar waxwings come in the spring, and the deer like it too. The lower one is all New England aster, which I've got to get rid of. I've got way too much of that. And then the one on the right is kind of an early spring bed. That's when I was still doing a lot of wood chips. This was probably within the last 2 or 3 years. That's that's my front yard. A lot of monarda in there, and there's some oxeye sunflower and some other stuff in there. I've got a lot of the red monarda that you'll see in the right, and there's the tall campylobacter, not campylobacter. What's the tall blue one? No, it gets this tall. Mine is. Campanula? I can't remember what it is. Tall bellflower is what it is. Yeah, that's what it is. And then this is the front of my house again, to the left, to the lower left. That's the bed that I just added last summer, or 2 summers ago. And it was a bunch of grass. The original grass that was out there in front of the house where I started my beds by bringing in topsoil. That grass was there when I built the house, so I just left it and mowed it. Well, there was one section, pretty good sized section, that didn't grow very good because it's too dry and sandy. So 2 years ago, and I don't have pictures, I should have taken pictures of it. 2 years ago, I got a lot of clear plastic, and that seems to be the best. I've tried killing grass with cardboard. That sort of works, but things work their way through, and I learned the hard way to take all the tape off the cardboard before you plant, because it shows up eventually. So anyways, that was my start. But I found the best way to kill grass is clear plastic, because I went, and it's just drop cloth plastic that you get in the paint department. And when I started this bed in the front, it's 20 yards by about 8 yards. It's a big oval, and it was about a fourth of what remaining yard I had in the front. And it's so dry and sandy. All I did was put some wood chips down on it. That's it. And then since then I've put leaves my neighbor brings over. But it's dry and sandy, and that's what this bed is to the right. That was last summer. So that's 2 years worth of growth there. I put a lot of rattlesnake master. I love rattlesnake. There's lupin in there. There's monarda punctata. There's wild strawberry. I put in some blue, well, there's vervain in there, and then there's a blue sage that I got from Prairie Nursery in Wisconsin that I just love, and a bunch of other stuff. I can't remember what else in there. And that's me. Any questions you can ask me at the end. But I strongly urge you, if you're going to take out grass, to use the clear plastic. I laid it down on top of the grass and just kind of got some of those little stakes, and just so it wouldn't blow away. And I left it for 2 months. I didn't touch it. And I found out that works better than, like, I had a gray tarp that I didn't want to go buy a 3rd or 4th package of clear plastic. So I laid the gray tarp, and it didn't kill it. Not near as good as the clear plastic, which surprised me. So that's the best way to kill grass.
The reason that clear plastic works better
It gets too hot.
is you're solarizing your soil. You're basically killing not just the tops, but the roots. If it gets too hot, you're also killing weeds.
It worked. I'm here to tell you it worked. Next.
Thank you very much. And our last speaker has the most inspirational yard for most of us that he's been working on for, 30 years now?
Yep.
And, it's gorgeous, so thank you, Tom, for coming.
Thank you.
Here.
And I change.
You press down.
I
on this.
press there. All right, thank you. Good evening, friends. I'm glad to be here. And most of you, I think, will recognize the picture, the slide there. It's the cover illustration from the book that Nancy and I completed and that most of you are familiar with. And I want to start with that because I want to start with some general principles. This is the Reader's Digest version, and I'm not going to go much into detail. But the principles that I want to emphasize are layers, niches, and edges. Layers, niches, and edges. And when Nancy died and I was charged with completing the book, I wanted to get a good illustrator for most of the illustrations, and that was Amelia Hansen, a scientific illustrator and artist who's now with the Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy. And I tried to explain to her what I meant by layers. And she kept coming up with something that didn't really look right to me. So I said, come on out and I'll show you what I mean. So she brought her sketchbook to our front yard, and what resulted was a pen and ink sketch of this illustration. And I said, looks to me like a cover illustration. Why don't you color it and put in some critters and we will use it? And so we did. And it's an illustration of one part of our yard where the emphasis is on layering and on the niches for various kinds of wildlife. The layer, the top canopy layer that you see there is a wild black cherry, and then it comes down to gray dogwood and elderberry, and on down to some decaying trunks and snags of an old crabapple, which we left there because that's part of the layering. And some of it had collapsed into the ground, into the soil, and that's part of the layering also. That snag layer, that layer of recovery of the soil, putting back into the soil what it brought forth, down to the leaf layer, the leaf mulch layer that you see there, and the grasses and the sedges and the forbs, and then the wildlife that depends upon these various layers of the landscape and the various niches within those layers. And part of that layering for us is building variations in the height and depth of the soil, because that's part of the diversity of the system. A few millimeters even of difference in the height of the soil or the amount of sun falling upon it makes a difference in the kinds of plants that thrive there. And you will find that as you work with your land and as you begin to change what, for most plots of urban and suburban land, is just flat, as you begin to change it into something that varies a great deal, of even a few inches of diversity, makes a real difference. So there is kind of my prime example of layering. And here are some layers from the back part of our property. On the left, the canopy is oak and hickory, and then the understory layer of redbud and dogwood, gray dogwood, shrub and vine layers, viburnums, elderberry, native honeysuckle, not the Asian, and native bittersweet, not the Asian. Center and right, the canopy is black cherry, the understory is pagoda and gray dogwood, the shrub layer, maple leaf and nannyberry viburnum, Indian currant, forbs, sedges, ferns, there's some cinnamon fern in there, some sedges of various kinds, and just trying to get as much diversity into our just under half an acre of land as we can get. Diversity of layering, diversity of edge, habitat. Tallamy and Dark both emphasize in the living landscape the importance of edges, that's what our urban and suburban yards have most in common with good habitat. Diverse edges where you can experiment, even within just a few inches or a few feet of distance, from sun to part sun to shade to low growing to higher and on up into your shrub layer and your understory layer and your canopy layer, where you are working with diverse conditions at every layer and on every edge and at every niche of your planting. Here is a kind of a broader scene from our backyard, just in early spring, when the spring ephemerals, which are largely the dominant part of our backyard planting, are just beginning to come into flower. And you can see the possibilities there. This dates from about, 10 years ago, this picture. You can see the possibilities there for various kinds of edges within that dominantly, not forested, but just kind of wooded, partially wooded area of dead wood, snags, and again, edging, because there's a kind of a patio area there which provides all kinds of possibilities for edge planting, and the little trellis that we've put up, allowing for vines and that kind of layering in the whole system. There's our yard 30 years ago, the before. Now that's what ordinarily one thinks of as park, right? Nice expanse of lawn and some trees, maybe a little shrub here and there. Well, that's not what Doug Tallamy has in mind by park, by Homegrown National Park. He has something more in mind like Yosemite or Yellowstone, where all the layers exist and all the edges and all the various diversity of levels and niches of little places for the wildlife to find their own level, their own niches, their own habitat. And then here is the same view about 5 to 8 years ago. You can see all the layers there. We are blessed with some tall trees that were there when I bought the house back in 1974. That's a wonderful American sycamore there, and there were some very fine red oaks in the planting. But all of the understory, all of the shrubbery, all of the base vegetative layers on down to the soil itself, that's pretty much what we've added in the past 30 years. And there is a view now of that same area that Amelia Hansen drew for the cover of the book. And there I'm standing in one of the paths leading into our property. And I'm surrounded by layers, by a pretty wild landscape, and a very diverse landscape in terms of the kinds of plantings, the levels of plantings, the openings in the plantings. And it's not something that I have planned. It's just kind of going with the flow and saying what we're after is the greatest possible diversity, and nature will lead and tell us how to do it. And if we do it wrong, we'll get corrected. And the greater wisdom will prevail. And it's not completely wild because we have these paths that we maintain and that we put down mulch, wood chips on, leading all through the property, and a sign out front that says, welcome. You're welcome into this property. I try to regard it not so much as private property, although I still do value our privacy to an extent. It's a commons. It's what was here before we as settlers came and privatized, or tried to privatize, virtually everything and commodify it. It was a commons, and the Native Americans dealt with it and lived with it and maintained it as a commons, open to all and to all the creatures, not just the human, but the more than human part of this wonderful system in which we partake. And there's one of the paths, and it just kind of winds back in there, and you don't know exactly where it's going to go. So that's a way of inviting people in. Maybe some really timid people might be kind of frightened by that, but most of them are not. And kids are not. They love to walk through and run through our property. And we have a swing that they can swing on and stop. And I put up old stumps. We collect logs and stumps from any tree cutting within the immediate neighborhood, and we use those as seats where people can sit and contemplate and look and just sit. And we have a little free library, and if they're bored by the plantings, they can take out a book and read. So we try to treat it as a commons, and we try to keep it open, and we try to open it up and provide niches for the human beings and for the more than human beings. And so I want to conclude with thanks to all those more than human beings who come to visit, and the human beings who come to visit, and you human beings who have come to be with us this evening, and to Quinn and the Portage District Library who have hosted us so beautifully, and thanks for all you do.
Thank you very much, Tom, and all of the rest of our presenters this evening. I'm not used to using this. We have run just a little bit late, so Quinn tells us we're not going to have time for questions and answers this evening. However, we do have a Facebook page that you can submit questions on, and we really encourage you to do that. You're certainly welcome to mingle and chat with one another for a few minutes, and we're going to have to bring the program to a close. Thank you so very much. Everybody got one of these? If you didn't get one of these, please, you can pick it up on your way out, because it also has the list of the native keystone plants in it. So, thank you.